Hi everyone. First of all, congratulations on finishing the semester. I hope you've learned a lot in this class. At the very least, if not facts, then new ways to think about food and new ways to explore how you think about food. So what I've done today for the conclusions is picked some of my favorite slides from the semester and created a bit of a review presentation for you. So first of all, I'd like to remind you that food is not just one thing. You look at a ripe red tomato and think a tomato is a tomato. But food is all about belief systems. Do you believe it's safe to eat tomatoes? Once upon a time, they were called death apples in Europe because of the way that the acid reacted with plates and silverware. Do you perceive this to be food? This might be a sculpture of a tomato. Do you have taboos about certain foods that might be technically edible, but not something that you would eat yourself? What kinds of local ecological knowledge do you have about food and producing food in your area? Is food accessible to you? Can you afford tomatoes right now? Are they on the shelves? Do you have preferences? Perhaps you just don't like to eat tomatoes. Some people don't. What about interactions between all of these things? You have many preferences, knowledge, beliefs, and perceptions about food is determined by your interactions with it. Have you had tomatoes in the past? How do you feel about them now? How do you like to cook them? So many different interactions between all of these. And at the very least, food is also flavor and taste because it should be edible. So let's talk about flavor and taste, a little bit of a recap. You technically have 5, possibly more, taste receptors on your tongue. The 5 well-known and studied categories of taste are sweet, salty, bitter, sour, and savory, or umami. You've read about all of these in your book, 8 Flavors. Research into current tastes, other taste sensations include fatty, that you can taste whether something's fatty or not, and also capsaicin, so this compound that causes a sensation of pain and heat. But people are also researching alkaline, like brine, which would be the opposite of sour, metallic, and water-like. And while taste prejudices can exist genetically, so we've talked in your discussion groups about how people vary in their sensitivity to bitter compounds and how for a subsection of the population, cilantro tastes really soapy. And this is written in your genes, how many taste receptors you have and how sensitive they are, and what the interpretation of different chemical compounds are. Most of your taste preferences can be learned and unlearned. And in fact, if you want to talk about bitter sensation, a lot of the top chefs in the world are super tasters for bitter, so bitter things taste even extra bitter to them. Yet they make a living cooking and eating bitter food. So we've talked a lot about how your taste preferences are continually learned and unlearned as you go through your life. So they're not set in stone. Now, the interesting thing about taste is that only after it's combined with smell do you really perceive a food's flavor. So up to about 90% of what you might call taste could actually be smell. And some people have no sense of smell. This is called anosmia. But if your sense of smell is temporarily impaired by if you have a stuffy nose, then you know that things taste duller and you don't get the whole range of aroma and flavor. Flavor is perceived through something called retronasal olfaction. So when you smell something, if you take a sniff and you breathe it in, that's just nasal olfaction. But if you take a bite of something and breathe the air back out through your nose, that's when the flavor is perceived, and that's called retronasal olfaction. And in fact, the receptors for your olfaction are the single largest family in the human genome. About 5% of your human genome is dedicated to these olfactory receptors that perceive flavor. But the experience of taste is very multisensory, far more multisensory than sight or touch. When you think about all that goes into perceiving flavor, aroma, texture, temperature, there's almost infinite flavors recombining all of these aspects of food. And of course, your eating is also influenced by your hearing, your sight, and your sense of touch. And last but not least, also memory. So like taste, our sense of smell is very closely linked to our emotions, partially because this is because both senses are connected to the involuntary nervous system. So that's why something that smells really bad can bring about vomiting or just nausea. But flavors that are appetizing can also increase the production of saliva and gastric juices, making some foods truly mouthwatering. But a lot of our sense of smell is very personal, and it's highly linked to our emotions and to our memories. So the sense of smell is the only part of the human sensory system that has a direct neurological link from the outside world to the limbic system in the brain that controls fear and other emotions. So this quick link to the brain allows other animals to detect the presence of an eager mate through odor molecules called pheromones. But this is the reason why the connection between smell and the limbic system can trigger these long buried memories. If you ever come across a smell and just have been brought back to it, place and time, it's because of the way our sense of smell works. And interestingly, we don't lose smell memories. So think about what you're eating at very emotionally salient times and perhaps highlight those smells. But as I said, you also eat with your eyes. If you try to eat something that's the wrong color or that looks like what you expect something to taste like, you're already pre-processing your food. You also eat with your ears. You can hear the difference between hot and cold beverages being poured. You can hear the difference between champagne and bubbly water being poured. Food doesn't taste as well in very loud circumstances. So if you've ever tried to eat a meal on a plane, you'll see that it does taste a lot more bland to you because your sense of hearing has been tampered with. But also, you eat with your heart. What you consider to be food is part of this perception. So, would you eat your pet? Would you eat a horse? In the podcast we listened to on Why These Animals, we talked about how the sensation of disgust is formed and how we eat just a fraction of the plants and animals that we actually could, partially because of these emotional responses to our perception of what food is and what isn't. And we had a discussion on artificial flavors as people demand to know what is in their food, what are they ingesting, and as they begin to care about where that comes from and what it's made of. So bringing us back to perception, we've also talked about foods for different occasions and how important context is for eating. So the things that we consider food vary by time of day, season, social occasion, and cultural milieu. So if you think about what you would eat for breakfast, lunch, and dinner, these are quite culturally prescribed meals. Would you eat these in the opposite direction? Would you bring a portable dinner or breakfast? Would you eat sweet dinner? Would you eat a large social lunch and a dinner solo? In what contexts might these occur? How might you eat different foods for season? Maybe something savory and hot in the winter, sweet and cold in the summer. How about combinations of sweet and savory? Would you put ketchup on your pancakes? How about syrup on your sausages? Would you eat different foods with a grandparent or a friend? Do you eat different foods at different ages? Children tend to have special foods marketed towards them. So our appetite for different tastes changes throughout the day, and it's very culturally bound and to some extent biologically bound also in terms of what we need to eat. But we've discussed some strategies to think about how you might systematically explore these, and I call that how to be a food anthropologist. First of all, my first check is to observe if your perception of reality matches actual reality. So we've talked about gender and food in here quite a bit. Is yogurt a women's food? Really? Look who's buying it in the grocery store. Look at ads. Look at whose refrigerator do you see it in. Look at the context in which people are eating it. Do you consider frozen yogurt to be yogurt? Are there different flavors marketed towards different genders? Are different genders actually eating different amounts of yogurt? So note to self what your perception is and then try to see if there's some gauge of what people are actually eating. My biggest tip for being a food anthropologist is do something that makes you feel uncomfortable socially and then think about why. So stand too close to someone in that elevator and might make you feel uncomfortable. Think about why. It has to do with norms of personal space in American society. So eat a non-gendered food. Eat food out of context. Eat something that you wouldn't normally consider food. Eat with your hands instead of a fork. Do something that makes you feel socially uncomfortable. And then think about the norms that are underlying the rules that you have been following, perhaps without even knowing it, your whole life. And then think about what would happen if the norm suddenly became arbitrary. So, what if you didn't have to eat spaghetti with a fork or a spoon or a knife? What, how would that meal change for you? How would a meal change for you if you weren't following gender norms? We talked about gender and class obliquely in here. They're rarely separated. And we talked about body types and eating patterns. Because a lot of times ideal body types and eating patterns are dictated by the resources that the upper class has access to. So, do you prefer to be fat or thin, light-skinned or dark-skinned? Is it okay to show your shoulders or your midriff? All of these are determined by cultural norms and a lot of times driven by upper class resources. What types of food do you aspire to? What types of eating patterns do you aspire to? And how are these aspirations marketed to you as well? Because food systems are not independent. A lot of the food systems that we have access to have very long supply chains, and how they get to you and what ends up on your table is determined by a lot of different factors. One of which is the environment. We've talked about ecology in here. Food is one of the ways we are most intimately connected to and part of the environment. Most of the other living things that humans care about are either food for us, like sweet potatoes and apples, or are organisms that we might be food for. Komodo dragons are certainly known to have killed and eaten humans in the past. But when you think about the environment, you think about preferences, like what symbolizes sweetness or desire or satiation. We also think about what is actually available to people. There might be a cultural standard of what you want to eat and how and with whom, but what can you actually cook and eat? What ingredients do you have access to? Do you live after the Columbian Exchange? Do you have access to coffee and tomatoes and corn, rice and olive oil and apples? What kind of tools do you have access to? What kind of fuel sources? What's the seasonality like? How do you actually have to live in your environment? And much has changed over the course of human history. One of my favorite examples here you've heard me talk about several times is the tu, otherwise known as the Chinese cleaver. It's the one on top here. The one below is a Western meat cleaver. And it has so many chopping functions. It's incredible that you can get more from a tu than a battery of French knives. But it's certainly a product of circumstances. This very frugal peasant culture where there's a limited amount of fuel wood to cook with, so chopping things up into nice bite-sized pieces can allow things to be cooked quickly and efficiently in a wok. And then this pairs nicely with chopsticks that you can pick up the bite-sized pieces with and place in your mouth. No fork and knife cutting required at the table. So there's this whole cuisine built around this necessity to deal with the scarcity of fuel wood, to unite cooking utensils like the tu with eating utensils like the chopstick that really have flowered into beautiful cuisines. We talked about pots a little bit. I love pots. They're fascinating because these also unite how you can cook, what you're cooking, and who you're cooking for. So if you look at the design of pots, I'd say first look at the size. How many people are you cooking for? What size of pot do you need? Then look at the bottom. Is it round? Is it flat? Does it have little legs? This will indicate how the pot is being heated. Is it a skin pot that's being stretched over a fire? And then also think about the types of foods that are being cooked in the pot. Are you boiling water? Are you steaming dumplings? Are you gently heating milk? There's so many different functions that pots provide, and they really were a turning point in human history, the invention of the pot, being able to cook food and transform it from raw ingredients to easily digestible meals. Really released a lot of extra nutrients and calories that humans have been able to take advantage of. Now, in your small groups, you've enjoyed several discussions over the course of the semester. One I wanted to highlight was our discussion on food as medicine, as a segue into our discussions of food as regulation, as being regulated. So one of the things we talked about was food can't be marketed as drugs because they're regulated separately, but food can also act as, I don't want to say treatment, but potentially curative for our perceptions of disease. And remember, we talked about disease as this medical diagnosis versus illness, things that we perceive as being sick. So you discussed special diets to help cure illness, foods that confer health. And in your book, you're reading about garlic and how garlic used to be a medicine in the United States, and now it's really transitioned more into a food. But there's still a ton of research going on about the medical properties of garlic and how eating garlic might do a variety of things for you, none of which have been entirely proven. But if you think about how you may be eating for your health, what you might eat that could make you sick, under what conditions, and also as part of your education on being a critical thinker, how do you know this information? Have you read medical journal articles? Have you read books? Have you looked up the credentials of the people who wrote those books? Remember your library badge training throughout your education, and remember how to check and identify good information versus bad information. Okay, so food is regulated by the government. It has to be sold as food, not a drug. You remember Mr. Warden talking about bottled water and how bottled water can't cure rheumatism. The Department of Agriculture regulates meat and poultry and eggs and non-game meats and the safe handling of storage of meats and organic food labeling, while the Environmental Protection Agency monitors the use of pesticides and insecticides as well as water quality. And there's usually a push and pull between producers and consumers. Not that consumers are always hapless individuals, being poisoned by food production, and not that food producers are angling to take advantage of consumers at every turn. But with long supply chains, usually often there's a middle person who might be pulling profit margins in their favor, and sometimes that can have inadvertent consequences for the consumer. So the USDA and the EPA do regulate food and what is labeled as food, so that hopefully you're not being taken advantage of too much by food fraud or adulterated foods. And as I said, these are associated with long supply chains, and you've probably eaten an adulterated food at some point in your life. With 40,000 products on supermarket shelves, there's no way to test them all. So usually food safety takes precedence, and authenticity can often take the back seat. But there's lots of examples like Manuka honey. New Zealand bees only make 15,000 tons of Manuka honey each year, but in the UK alone, people are buying 18,000 tons of it. What is happening? We talked about honey as a case study. It's quite easily adulterated with sugar water to bulk it out, to be able to sell more of the expensive honey by putting less in the bottle. And there's lots of very high-tech analysis to check whether the sucrose is in honey, is from different types of plants, do DNA testing on the honey. But honestly, a lot of the food fraudsters are able to keep ahead of the technology to check it. But that's why we have food labels. Labels are supposed to read for the most credulous person so that there's not any outright advertised fraud on our food. But of course, the nutrition labels, which are only instituted in the 90s, try to reflect the salient health concerns of the day. So they are changing, and watch as nutrition labels and food labels will change throughout your life. Right now, what's regulated to go on food labels is what's organic and what's GMO. But we've talked about what is not regulated to go on food labels, and that is these sell by, use by, best by dates. They're not safety dates. So, and the USDA says use your best sense. So if it smells funny, tastes funny, looks funny, don't eat it. But if it's past the sell by, use by, best by date, it's probably, it could be okay still. What's natural is not regulated. The USDA has not made a ruling on what can be called natural and what can't, FYI. And what is marketed as a superfood is not regulated. So these are foods that are advertised to also act as medicines to confer health benefits. Now, some diseases really do result from nutrient deficiency, like scurvy or anemia. You need to eat some vitamin C or some iron, and that can be solved by nutrients-dense diets and foods, but there's no evidence or regulation for the use of the term superfood, and it's $1 billion global industry. Usually it's some sort of exotic fruit like pomegranate or acai berry, but also lately has been applied to super grains. It's a term not commonly used by experts, dietitians, or nutrition scientists, many of whom will dispute that particular foods have the health benefits that are being advocated. So just be aware that this is not regulated, and you might be seeing more of it in the future as people try to take advantage of this high earning food industry. Make your own choices, do your own research, pay attention to your own body about what makes you feel good, and try to eat a healthy, balanced diet. Moving into the end of the course, we began to investigate what happens to food after we're done with it. So we call this food rescue or food salvage. So this could be food that's edible but not sellable. Food that goes uneaten is considered to be food waste. This happens at all stages of the food production cycle, growing the food, processing the food, selling the food, and consuming the food. During the pandemic, there was a lot of food waste happening. Here in Idaho, farmers were dumping potatoes in the desert because the restaurant orders went way down and people weren't making as many French fries. With meat processing plants closing, there's real concern over what's going to happen to all these animals that were raised for slaughter that might not be able to be slaughtered now. Fruits and vegetables being left to rot in the field, again, as restaurant orders go way down, and perhaps pork belly being a little cheaper, as there haven't been as many restaurant orders for pork belly. So how can all this food be rescued? Well, you can go and drive out to some of the local farms. Some of them have been advertising free produce that they've had to just scrap, basically, because no one's buying it. Most of the food waste in the U.S. happens because of a transportation issue of not being able to get the food that's been produced to the people who need it. So while there is a lot of food waste happening in the country, about 1 in 6 to 1 in 8 people still are going hungry. So one of the ways that food can be rescued is can be transferred to food pantries and soup kitchens. Household planning can go a long way. I love this ad from the 1940s. Buy food with thought, cook it with care, use less wheat and meat, buy local foods, serve just enough, use what's left, don't waste it. I think a lot of these lessons still apply to food waste today. Now, one of the things that's been going on with food waste patterns is that we've been shifting to a more industrial food supply system. So if you look at rural economies, far fewer people are participating in food production today than they used to. 100 years ago, about 41% of the workforce farmed. By 1945, that's 16%. By the year 2000, that's just 2%. This goes hand in hand with dramatic increases in farm productivity that have allowed us to feed more people than ever before, and for most people, make food cheaper than it's ever been before. So farm productivity has actually increased by about 75% during this time. But what that means is that U.S. agricultural production has shifted away from these smaller family-owned farms to larger industrialized farming agriculture. This, like I said, this makes food more affordable, but these larger farms operate on a scale that makes agriculture economically unsustainable for a lot of small growers. And there's been growing concern in the U.S. about this lack of young farmers being prepared to take up the country's food production, the ability to hire labor to grow and harvest produce, like finding the pickers to harvest the peppers used to make sriracha sauce, and even the ecological consequences, like the loss of soil fertility in the U.S. Soil fertility is suspected to be greatly lower than it was 100 years ago. So one of the things that rural economies have been doing is participating in agritourism, and there are many, many opportunities for participating in agritourism around Idaho, and this can be up to 90% of household income for small producers. So this can be having farm-to-table dinners, farm tours, selling food at local farmers markets, having a pumpkin patch so people come and buy pumpkins at, having concerts at your winery, a lot of other ways to bring in money to small-scale agriculture. And one of the keys that I think we're going to see in the future is this diversification of, or I should say re-diversification of small-scale farms, and re-diversification of our food industry, of where we get food from. So if it happens that sometime in the future you can't find products at the grocery store, check in with your local producers, and they might have some things available. And of course, this tension goes hand in hand with regulation. How do you regulate small-scale farmers while still, for safety, while still allowing them to diversify and produce in ways that make small-scale farming possible? So we might see these agritourism development districts. We are probably going to see a lot of household production increasing. Whether or not, however it happens, it's a necessity to eat. So we're going to continue facing the challenges of a changing agricultural system, whether we like it or not. And unfortunately, none of us can predict the future, although a lot of people like to try, but no one knows what the world will be like in 25 years. Look back 25 years, 1995. Could you have predicted the internet? Probably not. Could your great-grandmother have predicted the microwave? Probably not. So who knows if we'll be using food replicators or slop or food in a pill? It's impossible to know, but that's why you're being trained to be critical thinkers, not encyclopedias, so that you can actively solve problems about how to get dinner on your plate. One of the things that I call you to do is to just be aware of your behavior, first of all. Do that food as an anthropologist's self-observation, because you do vote with your money or vote with your behavior. The choices that you make have long-term consequences for supply chains. So just be aware that the choices you make, even of how you're going to get your cup of coffee, has impacts on the system that gets the food to your table. If possible, when possible, please think critically about the food choices that you're making. So what's the future of eating? Well, people do have to eat. I am critical that we'll ever have food in a pill. There's so much more that goes into eating than just nutrition. We're feeding the body, we're feeding the soul, and it really takes us back to these critical discussions of what is food. There must be something behind our insatiable desire to eat vicariously as we do through all of these food television programming, history and relationships, science and art, travel and culture. There's so many experiences wrapped up in the act of eating. So, my last advice to you before we close the course: if possible, eat a balanced diet, diversify. There's a nutritionist on campus. Contact me if you'd like her contact information, or just look up Marley Harris. We also have a food pantry if you'd like some help diversifying what's on your plate or trying new things. Please wash your fruits and veggies. Think about where your food comes from. Think about where it goes. I think a lot of you were surprised by the food waste activity. Be aware that food preferences can and do change. So please, please be open-minded. Try new things. Try old things in new ways. Enjoy exploring food programming and books and movies and magazines, and cooking and eating together, and do all of these things to make food part of one of the ways that you can enjoy your life. Okay, it's been a pleasure teaching you with everything that has happened. I wish you the very best for your university education going forward, and please be in contact with me if you have any questions. Thanks.